Loading. Come on. All right, cool. All right, so let's get started. Thanks for coming out, guys. So I want to thank you all for coming. This is going to be a project about a variable font project, open source. This is a project. Blah blah blah. Right again. This is a project about a variable font towards social good. This is particularly towards serving people of low proficiency reading. And here's some of the main outlines we're going to talk about today. So first is the state of affairs presented to me from speaking with the nonprofit organization called Rev Reading, led by PhD candidates of psychology. Basically, by beginning that conversation with them, my seeking to understand the nature of the problem they discussed with me. Some points about why this caught interest to me as a type designer. Some foundations of cognitive psychology that was shared to me from collaborating with this scientist, the particular process of applying this understanding to a variable font, and finally, from this information and from the experiences, make the case for the groundwork for a capacity of typography to have moral knowledge in ethical concerns or ethical questions in general. So this is part tech demo, part design process, journal, part philosophical treatise, I guess you could put it that way. I hope this is going to be rewarding and encouraging for everybody in the audience. So let's get started. So very first thing to get started in the background, I was approached in March 27th of last year from the collective called Rev Reading. They discovered my work for Google Fonts with Quicksand Improvement. That was the font in question, and an interview regarding to that project on the Design Recharge podcast. In particular, this conversation of the three current members of it, Bonnie Schaefer Troop is a educational consultant and therapist with 25 years of educational experience and is currently a PhD candidate in cognitive psychology. So when I had the initial conversation with them, they made a presentation to me which made the following points. First, that the ability to read quickly and efficiently is an essential skill in the digital world for dealing with information and obtaining it. Yet reading problems are and have been a significant issue in the United States. For example, the U.S. Department of Education reports that nearly 7 out of 10 students of any age are non-proficient readers and will remain so throughout their lifetime. The final note was this reading problem will be pervasive across age, gender, and socioeconomic status with long-term costs and harm to those said individuals. So this caught my attention as a type designer because I could fully admit that what is type and how it's used is very broad in a contemporary practice. One very specific definition or specific understanding of type that can be agreed to, I think, by everybody in this room is an end of typography is to enable comprehension of information. And reading enables comprehension of information. So when I hear about reading is currently hindered for 70% of the US population, I'm making the inferment then typography is currently hindered for 70% of the US population. This seems to be a very serious issue. So from there, Bonnie shared with me, and it just caught my interest. So I was like, I'm interested in moving forward on this. How can we work together? There was a lot of great collaboration and understanding between Bonnie and myself, me as a practitioner of a type designer, and Bonnie as a cognitive psychologist and practitioner of educational therapy for people with disabilities like dyslexia and print sensitivity, as Bonnie would say. So she explained to me some concepts and points from cognitive psychology. Proficient reading is a rapid process. Character recognition occurs in nanoseconds. It occurs basically in a time-space relation. Any interruption of that process can impede the process of proficient reading. Interruptions are generally classified as either crowding or masking. In general, just to clarify up front, from understanding from Bonnie, crowding is a kind of masking. So going forward, I would just say visual masking. That is the term being used. So there are three types of visual masking, and as I said, crowding is a kind of visual masking, and in particular, crowding is a kind of what is called pattern masking. This is the case when two overlapping shapes touch each other directly. The reasons for this is because it causes confusion for the perceiver to understand which are distinct objects versus just one mass together. There's also meta-contrast masking, which is the shapes are too close together, causing confusion of perception. And lastly, is something called forward dot masking. There's no particular term for it. Apparently, there's this idea that the four dots that are separate from each other, but in a very close enough relation to cause a kind of gestalt square being produced, causes a similar visual masking effect. And again, this is when we say visual masking, we mean a phenomenon perception in which conscious recognition of a shape is omitted due to these said processes of these factors of masking. Which is super fascinating. These are some points that are intuitive to type designers. The idea of things being too crowded or interletter spacing being too tight might seriously have very significant issues in reading experiences. In fact, even the Gestalt kind of negative space relationships implied causing weird visual effects. I know from my own practice, there have been times that's been the case. I can never pin my finger on it exactly what it is, but there's some kind of relation of the negative spaces and the counters or the aperture with the side bearings that is just causing some weird perceptual thing going on. I could never articulate it, but this at least does a better job of articulating those intuitions I've gained from practice. Finally, from the text from the research of cognitive psychology is a claim for customization of typography to optimize visual perception capacity. So basically that human beings in general apparently have a certain bandwidth of tolerance for visual perception. And we can facilitate that by customizing typography to facilitate people with lesser visual perception capacity from things either from eyesight concerns to like loss from eyesight or diminishment of eyesight, dyslexia as classic examples, or just people who are, as Bonnie would call them, print sensitive. There's something about the technology of type and the way it's been cultivated that does not serve a very significant population, in this case 70% of the US population. So from there, the shaver shape formulations were developed by Bonnie, which had three major characteristics, particularly in shape, size, and spacing. These factors create greater lag time and reduce potential crowding and masking effects, which really just masking effects. This led to the formulations, and this had immediate improvement in reading performances for subjects empirically. So the first thing it behooves me to discuss as a type designer and with this audience is the shape decision. So the first thing they did in the testing was test out generally accepted typefaces for text settings. So in this case, Times New Roman. The very act of switching from Times New Roman to they use Avant-Garde Medium. I'm showing the Rev Reading font as an example because it was sourced from that. That switch apparently had the cognitive improvement effects seeked for the population. So that's very fascinating because obviously we would never expect a display geometric sans like Avant-Garde to be appropriate for this kind of need or end. But that the research is showing otherwise, so I have no choice but to have to accept those points as valid. But very telling. At the very telling points. I understand how controversial this is. It's a general point, but again, the evidence is shown from Bonnie's empirical research that this is the case. This is one major aspect of it. We can argue the reasons why. Contrast might be a very significant factor. Times New Roman is really high in contrast. I would say the nature of the spacing related to that contrast. There's many different factors I think could explain that from my practical understanding. Bonnie had particular notes from her practice as an educational therapist. We had great conversations about understanding each other. Some particular notes is the idea of roundness of letters, removal of kind of abrupt movements when possible, like in uppercase G, and the emphasis of the median line between the cap height and the descent and the baseline, and the median line between them being a really relevant point. So, for example, one of the points she really loved about quicksand as a base start, because that's how our conversation started, was my work on quicksand, was the kind of the median point area where the vertex of the M met at the crotch area in the bottom, for example. Some other notes, like I said, for the M apply for the W, and commentary about things like explicitness of apertures, terminals were very important for discussion, and Bonnie made clear to me about those points. And other things like disambiguous shapes like the I and J, for example, adding horizontal strokes to make sure they're not confused for other letters. So kind of typical legibility concerns we understand from our practice itself. It applies also for the lowercase. A lot of commentary discuss about aperture intentions, roundness of letters. It's going to be a very high priority. And I think in general, I did try to push on them for a two-story A at the minimum. But the basic proposition made counter to that request from me was students are just taught one-story A's and G's now. So for them, they are literally confused by the added complexity of the two-story A and G. Rather annoying, but we have to deal with the reality of the ground of what we're dealing with here. And it's continuing forward. And the idea of disambiguity of forms is a priority. So there's also a weighing of values here, in the sense that for the A, I made the argument of distinctness of forms, but that was countered by familiarity. But in this case, for the Y, this was an argument, that was a set argument of similarity of forms having to be differentiated. So the U was be more effective. It was a diagonal form instead of the vertical straight U kind of form we're seeing in Quicksand as a source. And then numbers as well. There's some commentary, particularly on the terminal, the 9 and the 6. That was a very, very point bonding made to me. And there were some particular points you thought was very effective in Quicksand in general, like the 0 as an example. So besides shape, as you can tell, it's a pretty significant area of discussion. Font size was another. Less relevant to type design, but more relevant to typography. The font sizes in question were 14 point to 26 points, so obviously much larger than the traditional typesetting practices we know of, like 8 point to 12 point, I would say, in general practice. So beyond font size decisions, also the expansion of outlines and spacing is probably the most distinctive aspect of the formulation from the shape for true formulation. The hyper expansion of the spacing allows more time between the letter forms, reducing potentials of visual masking. That's the basic thesis behind it. It is interesting challenges in the sense that developing, for example, even random things like word spaces to be effective at this super expanded form is a very telling idea or issue. It was very interesting to me to deal with that. Also, just on a side note, actually I'll discuss this in a second, so we're good for now. All right, so from all that said, I was able to develop a brief from understanding the nature of this project. So I made a proposal that we were going to use Quicksand as a base. We're going to convert it into this proper Lexan font design that will be open source. And it will be basically 2 steps in this brief. One is the 7 static fonts that are specific instances that apply the formulation from Bonnie. And then, as well as the static font, a variable font that uses the formulation to allow fine-grained customization of said formula. So that would be the brief. So the project began on March 26th. The first step was to match the weight from their basic source samples they were using in their previous testings that got them their results. The main note about that is the Avant-Garde medium is a relatively heavy color, typographic color. It's very dense. So Quicksand did not really have one because it went from regular to bold. So I had to do interpolations to find a weight that was towards the medium. This is the first step of that, upper and lower case. And it was agreed that version BC, something between the two, was the proper one. So I basically went to the extremes. Both are D and A are too extreme. B and C is closer to the right range. One is too light, one is too dark. So we have to find something in the middle. On to March 9th, we clarified the weight, and I began the procedure up into developing the basic control 14 level of the formulation. So as you can tell, the rounded terminals were removed, and the project was begun. So this is again it's Avant-Garde as the source to review what's going on between the two sources. Fast forward to May 21st, I completed the base 14 and I moved on to the 26 setting. And here's a demonstration of those two extremes. As you can tell, the hyper expansion of letter form, spacing, and outlines is very distinctive and very bizarre. It's not very usual looking. Let's be blunt about this. But these are the two extremes of the variations. And then from there, we're using interpolation. We were able to then develop the steps instances in between. So they follow the system based on the type size that were just correlated with it. So 16, 18, 20, 22, and 24 are instances of the masters of 14 and 26. This is some examples of it, and those said font sizes and those fonts as well. So in addition to the static fonts, it was variable fonts, and again, the virtue of the variable fonts is we can specify a custom axis, which is what I did. I called it rev reading, and it allows for this fine-grained transition from uppercase, from the extremes of the masters to the instances in between. So that was previously uppercase. This is the lowercase being shown sliding through. So again, it allows you a user to, instead of having to specify from like a list of a litany of variations, right, of width, weight, all this other stuff, it's all compressed into one axis that allows for low cognitive workload to use, and allow a user to very quickly set a text setting to what they would ideally want. So this plus font size would be the two reasonable, very controlled metrics. I mean, font size and letting are pretty already pretty established to be used by users. This is just the added access to it as my thing is loading. There you go. Oh, really? Oh, technology. This is a demonstration of that. Okay. And then also this, I'm still working on the accent characters, but I wanted to show this point. There's actually a serious question of do the accent characters need a hyper expansion as well or not? So that's a serious question to be asked, which is very interesting. But again, the virtue of the variable fonts is not only do we allow fine gradation movements continuously, we have direct instances, explicit instances that are capable of being selected. So this achieves both compatibility for general use, that we can specify specific fonts, but also this really fine, meeting actually the ideal end of the research of cognitive psychology, which is customized typography settings for a user on a case-by-case basis. So I said previously, this is a social good project, right? And so therefore, this is a question of ethics. And in the domain of ethics for design, there has been, I see a lot of conversation online about designers being responsible for the ends of their production, as well as their means. Actually, excuse me. The claim is made designers are responsible for the ends of their production. The concern of design is not only means, but also ends. That is the point. Excuse me. Mike Montero wrote a very long essay about this point. He starts it off with a designer is responsible for the work they put in the world. So again, it's not just you doing good work, it's also where is it going? What end is it trying to serve? If it's doing a certain end that is harming people, then you are not being ethical. You're failing as a designer. That is the claim he is making. But in addition, I've seen many conversations that apply that an individual who partakes in design must also be virtuous as well. It is not necessarily being virtuous and our means and ends by themselves are not sufficient. It is also required that the actor themselves taking the action must be virtuous as well. I mean, a very easy demonstration of that is Eric Gill. It's gone to the point where I think it's very clear that people have a very strong aversion of using his fonts or discussing him explicitly in an affirmative manner as a virtuous person, or his work as being virtuous, because of the vice of himself and his ill behavior that I don't need to go into right now. But that point of demonstration is showing there's obviously a contingency of expectation that not only one's actions, but the actor doing those actions must be virtuous as well. I've seen those other examples. There's a friend of mine, Joseph, who posted on Twitter recently, so many designers claim an egalitarian, inclusive, and socialist ethos, when in practice they are elitist, exclusatory, and egocentric. So this is pointing out, again, this tension of the action and the actor. There is a tension of our claims of, by our capacity of design, we are taking actions, and we have imperatives of that, our ethos, that's what he's implying by that. But in actuality, the actors who are partaking in that action are elitist, exclusatory, and egocentric. They are they're antithetical to the claims being made that are the good for design. So there's a tension here. It's not resolved. But the problem is the way Alonso chooses to resolve this tension is, I sense, not just him, but a lot of people do when they see this problem, is we look outside design to answer what are the correct ends for design. In general, I see usually two: morally good clients or magnanimity of resources. There tend to be the two ways we address this tension. So Alonso does so. He says, if you are in an educational space, offer free classes for those who can't afford it. If you're an industrial designer, make products that fit a underserved niche. Now, I'm kind of parsing through what he means by this, but when he says fit a underserved niche, this seems to be implying some kind of brief that you're serving. So therefore, you're not dealing with people usually addressed. So this is in a client relation. So therefore, this is assuming you're working with a client who is serving underserved audience in this case. And then the claim with help lower income homes again is a claim towards magnanimity of resources. And then the final note is again a very explicit move of looking outside design for a moral good is the just buy a sandwich for a homeless person. So this is again a kind of charity and magnanimity of resources, but this has nothing to do with, as a said designer, by the emphasis of the just buy a sandwich. And just the little things. So this tells me this is not contingent to the design components or capacities of an individual, but just as a human being, they should do this thing like this magnanimity of resources of giving a sandwich. So that's not relevant to this discussion right now. Okay, so this also poses the question, if we're pointing outside design to answer the question, what is the good? What is virtuous? I don't think it's very clear what is virtuous at all. Here's an example from this Joseph thread. Ethics and morals of the past will not be the ethics and morals of the future. It's not fixed. It's transitory. It moves. It is not something we can ground with any kind of certainty or any kind of clarity of confidence. And he's claiming that people who preach ethics of design, he's calling them out as if they don't actually know what they're talking about, and it's actually there's no grounds for this. It's a false pretense. So I think what this Twitter post is pointing out to is a similar hesitation I have too, on two grounds. One is he's actually making the argument that ethics is transitory and morals are transitory. They're not objective. They're not based on any kind of fixed proximities that we can ground our behaviors and reference points to, which I might challenge him on in a second. But the more particular point here is that in design, he's arguing that we don't even know what it is in general. How can we even know about for design? That part I agree with him absolutely on. I think that's a very interesting point he's making right there. All right, so let's compare this to medicine, shall we? The end of medicine is health, right? Medicine is successful when people are healthy. It fails when people are not healthy. Doctors are practitioners of medicine. Doctors possess knowledge of both the means towards health and the end of health itself. Doctors must know what is healthy and what is not healthy, and must know how to achieve health and how not to achieve it. Those are the criteria of them possessing knowledge of health, and that possession of knowledge is what makes them practitioners of medicine. So, from these definitions and understanding, my point is self-contained within these definitions, we have criteria of assessment of moral truths or moral knowledge of health in this case. A doctor can basically make deliberations and make reasoned decisions based on these parameters. I'll just an example. If your leg is dislocated, the point of knowing that this dislocated leg is harmful and is not healthy is the first point. And second, the doctor will know how to relocate the leg back in position. And then they can use deliberation because, for example, the idea of healthiness is preventing harm or not harming. So when you're relocating the leg, you're going to cause harm. It will cause pain. But the whole point is, in an act of deliberation of reason, explicit reason, we can weigh the harm of relocating the leg to the harm of not doing anything and letting that leg stay dislocated. So clearly, one is far outweighs the other, and it guides action. So that is the whole point. Look what's happened here. I've just basically demonstrated a very rational, internal, self-contained logic that is objective and grounded that can guide decisions. And therefore define a good and a moral good blah blah. A moral knowledge is now possessed by a doctor on the grounds of health. Let's compare that to typography, shall we? If we argue that typography's end is comprehension, I'm going to knock out information because I'm going to just presume it's of information. So its end is comprehension of typography. Again, it's very specific definition and it's very specific framing. I'll be very clear about that. Of comprehension. Typographers are practitioners of typography. Therefore, a typographer would have to have knowledge of both the means towards comprehension and the end of comprehension itself. If a typographer does not possess both of those, they're not typographers. I mean, just that's the whole. Following the same model from medicine. Now, so let's walk through this chain of definitions. So I want to first just add in a little note. Comprehension is a kind of understanding, right? I think that'd be fair. I think it's fair to say they're synonyms. They're related to each other, but understanding has a larger context. Because understanding promotes human flourishing in Eudaimonia. This is within traditions of ethics, of philosophy. It's one of the virtues that promotes this. And Eudaimonia is considered the highest virtue, is the ultimate end, is the end to itself that everything else leads to or derives from combining the Aristotelian virtue ethics. Things that hinder human flourishing are harmful to human beings. That say we can agree with that proposition. Okay. Based on those points I just added in, if we go back to my original slides I showed in the very beginning of this talk, the end for typography is to enable comprehension of information. Reading enables comprehension of information. Reading is currently hindered for 70% of the U.S. population. Therefore, typography currently harms 70% of the population. So, that is the conclusions I can come to based on these points made, and this is what drew me to be my moral imperative to want to engage with Rev Reading and to go on this journey with them to develop the Lexan fonts. Now, the conclusion I would love everyone to walk away with from this conversation is not only some particulars on just developing variable fonts, how they work, even there's a timeline of how to work with clients. As you notice, it's a pretty significant amount of time has already occurred, and quite frankly, the font project is not that large. It's not that large of a font project. But also the idea that this is an example of demonstration of how to apply variable font technology as a means towards the good of human flourishing, Eudaimonia, by extension, right, through comprehension, which is a form of understanding. But this idea of that typography self-sufficient good of comprehension, from that specific self-sufficiency, we have a duty to seek to understand from both episteme and techne sources of knowledge of that good. So this is theory and technique, right? Idea of we're engaging with people from the sciences that can provide epistemology knowledge to us on these grounds of the good of comprehension, and as well as us as practitioners, what we can offer to the equation towards that good of comprehension. Afterwards, after seeking to understand, we then can apply that moral knowledge both to the means and ends by cultivation of virtue. And that is the point, is that this is now, I'm hoping, I fully admit this is not definitive, this is not exhaustive, because if you notice, I am, the question in the very beginning, not the beginning, the examples I shown were about design with a capital D, like a general group. I'm not prepared to even talk about that group yet. I can only speak about, in this very particular moment, typography and its particular ends in and of itself. However, with that said, I do hope this is a case for the groundwork of the capacity in design to possess a moral knowledge for its own sake, and can contribute such knowledge to the pursuit of the ultimate good, Eudaimonia. If we're going to argue that designers are responsible to both our means and ends of our actions, much like a doctor is, this would have to presume designers have a moral knowledge that is exclusive to them, much like doctors have a moral knowledge that is exclusive to themselves. And again, the doctor's case, it's health. And my proposition is in typography in particular, it's comprehension. So things that hinder comprehension are against the imperatives of typography and are therefore harmful and vices and should be averted from and removed. But this is all grounded self-contained. I do not need to rely on transitory outside things on the outside society and culture to inform me what is the good here. I can do so internally from the self-sufficient logic of typography in general. That is the hope. That's the case I'm making here. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, And this is very tentative, both in my process of working, of thinking about this in general, and again, at the minimum, I hope you just gain some benefits of demonstration of how your work as a designer can be towards social good in a very explicit, direct way. I think that's a part for me why I love this project so much, and I was very excited to share this with you today. So thank you so much for your time. Look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.